On February 10, our country celebrates a professional holiday, the Day of a Diplomatic Worker, established by the decree of the President of the Russian Federation of October 31, 2002. This indicates a high public recognition of the profession of a diplomat, the important role of the domestic diplomatic service. The date of the holiday is connected with the earliest documentary mention, February 10, 1549, of the ambassadorial order, the first state structure in the history of our country in charge of foreign affairs. However, the age of the Russian diplomatic service is much older. Old Russian state from the 9th century acted as an active participant in international relations in Europe. The Russian embassy in Constantinople in 838 was symbolic, where Russia was first represented at the court of the Byzantine Emperor Theophilus as an independent state, and Ingelheim in the capital of the Frankish state in 839. In 860, the old Russian state received international recognition by concluding the peace agreement and love with the Byzantine Empire. This is the first of the legal acts known in the history of Russia. Diplomacy became an organic part of ancient Russian statehood. It expressed and defended the geopolitical interests of the East Slavic peoples. Using the existing by that time trade river and sea routes, INCL. Known from antiquity the way from the Varangians to the Greeks, they established contacts with their neighbors, other countries and peoples. The objects of foreign policy of Russia were a total of about 40 different states, principalities and unions. These relations have especially expanded and strengthened with the adoption of Christianity in Russia. From the second half of the 11th century up to the Tatar-Mongol invasion, due to the fragmentation of the state, the unity of the foreign policy and diplomacy of Russia was violated. The most influential princes themselves entered into international unions and carried out foreign policy relations. However, by the 15th century, after the overthrow of the Horde yoke and the strengthening of the centralized Russian state with its capital in Moscow, specific diplomacy gave way to autocratic. Russia became an increasingly influential state. Moscow princes maintained regular relations with 24 foreign states in the west and east. The issues of foreign policy were dealt with by the Grand Duke and the Boyar Duma. To solve the problems facing Russian diplomacy from the end of the 15th century, the creation of a special department was required. He became one of the three most important orders of state administration, the ambassador, headed by the Duma clerk Im Viskovity. The structure and functions of this institution acquired complete forms by the years 50 to 70. 17th century, then the first permanent diplomatic missions abroad were created. During this period, Russia's foreign policy took care of protecting national interests, understood as an increment of the territory, wealth and population of the country. The focus was on ensuring the security of Russia's eastern borders, protection of the southern borders of Russia from the campaigns of the Crimean Tatars and Turkey, reunification with Russia of the West Russian, Ukrainian and Belarusian lands, providing access to the Baltic Sea. The milestone on the difficult path of the country's entry into the system of international relations after the time of troubles and foreign intervention at the beginning of the 17th century, which threatened Russian statehood itself, was the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, the cornerstone in establishing order in Europe, one of the guarantors of which was Russia. The victory in the Northern War, the adoption by Peter I of the imperial title in 1721, marked a fundamental change in the international situation of Russia. Its approval as a great power was accompanied by the expansion of the network of permanent diplomatic missions in the leading countries of the world. In 1720, the ambassadorial order was transformed into the College of Foreign Affairs (KID). KID acted according to special rules and was in charge of Russian relations with foreign states. During the period of KID's activity, a galaxy of talented diplomats has grown, laying down the basic principles and methods of Russian diplomacy for a long future period. G.I. Golovkin, B.I. Kurikin, P.P. Shafarov, A.I. Osterman, A.P. Bestujev-Ryamin, N.I. Panin, A.A. Bezborodko, etc. 18th century occupies a special place in the history of Russian foreign policy. Russian statehood was rising to a new level, and the very nature of the country's policy was gradually changing, adapting to the new position of a great power. The main directions of the international activity of the Russian state were formed, in the new socio-economic, political, international conditions. The foundations of ideology and traditions were laid, which began to guide the ruling circles of the country in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Brilliant diplomatic victories marked the age of Catherine II. The center of gravity of the country's foreign policy was transferred to the solution of the Black Sea problem. As a result of 2 wars and a diplomatic struggle, Russia went on a wide front to the Black Sea, acquired the right to navigate its merchant ships through the Bosporus and Dardanelles, as well as to patronize the Christian peoples enslaved by Turkey. Military and diplomatic efforts were aimed at creating a vast multinational state. The structure of Russia included many peoples of Eastern Europe, the Caucasus, Central and Central Asia. Russia strengthened its position in the Black Sea region, and Crimea was annexed. The process of reunification of Ukraine and Belarus with Russia was completed. Important promising areas were identified in Asia, the movement both to the east, Pacific research and fishing expeditions, the founding of Russian America, and to the south, annexation of part of Kazakhstan, which suffered from the brutal aggression of the Dzungaria. In Transcaucasia, according to the George Treaty of 1783, Tsar of Kartalinsky and Kakheti Irakli II recognized the patronage and supreme power of Russia. The growing influence of the empire in Europe and the expansion of its possessions in Asia and North America created the prerequisites for turning Russia into a world-class power. By the end of the 18th century, the tasks of strengthening ties with the states of Central and Western Europe, accessing the ice-free seas, and affirming the country's great power status have been resolved. In 1802, a unified system of executive authorities was created in Russia, the Cabinet of Ministers. The board was replaced by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. First Foreign Minister A.R. Vorontsov formed a temporary office, which was initially divided into 4 expeditions engaged in political correspondence. Later, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs acquired a branched and clear structure. Officials were assigned ranks in accordance with the international classification established by the Vienna Congress 1815. The diplomatic ranks adopted in 1815 lasted in Russia until October 1917. The international situation and the country's internal situation prompted Alexander I to develop a new foreign policy concept, which was based on the desire to establish a lasting balance in Europe based on the principles of legitimism. During the Napoleonic Wars, Russian diplomacy was guided by the task of creating anti-French coalitions and crushing the Bonaparte Empire. Russia's victory in the Patriotic War of 1812 and its participation in the liberation of European countries were of great international importance for strengthening the international influence of our country. The outcome of the long period of European wars was summed up by the Vienna Congress 1814–1815, which laid the foundations for a new, Vienna system, of international relations, in which Russia played a leading role, thanks to its military and diplomatic successes. In subsequent years, Russian diplomacy made great efforts to maintain the current balance of power in the European arena. To this end, Alexander I initiated the creation in September 1815 of the Holy Alliance of the Monarchs of Russia, Austria and Prussia, which later joined the majority of European rulers. Along with the European trend in Russian foreign policy in the first half of the 19th century, its Eastern policy gains great weight. One of the main tasks is solving the issue of the Black Sea Straits. This was of great economic, political and military strategic importance for the country and had a significant impact on relations not only with Turkey, but also with England, France and Austria. The patronizing policy regarding the Christian population of the Balkan Peninsula, which was to varying degrees dependent on the port, remained traditional for Russia. The second half of the 19th century. It was also noted by Russia's efforts to annex the Caucasus, which was seen as a military strategic bridgehead for all of its eastern politics. The basic principle of building a multinational Russian empire was national universalism. The words belong to Nicholas I, German, Finnish, Tatar, Georgian. This is what Russia is. In an effort to ensure the security of the eastern borders, Russian foreign policy was solving the problem of strengthening its influence in Central Asia and China, primarily by establishing diplomatic relations and developing trade ties. by the beginning of the 19th century, refers to the establishment of diplomatic relations with the United States of America. Crimean War of 1853 to 1856 and the Paris Congress became the frontier of an era in the history of international relations. The Vienna system has finally ceased to exist. It was replaced by other systems of unions and associations of European states. One of the most important lessons of Russia's defeat in the Crimean War was the awareness of the need to build a foreign policy based on national interests. The main task of diplomacy began to be formulated as creating favorable external conditions for the implementation of internal reforms in all areas, for which a long peace was needed. To solve this problem, Russia needed to overcome international isolation and eliminate the detrimental consequences of defeat in the war. Diplomatic efforts in this direction by Minister A.M. Gorchakov ended in 1870 with an important foreign policy success, the abolition of the restrictive articles of the Paris Treaty. Russian diplomacy continued to defend the rights of the Christian peoples of the Ottoman Empire, expanding the political influence of its state in the Balkans by supporting the struggle of these peoples for the liberation and creation of nation-states. In the second half of the 19th century, the principle of multi-vector foreign policy of Russia is being strengthened, the role of the Central Asian and Far Eastern directions is being strengthened. For many years, Russian-English rivalry has become a determining factor. A series of treaties with China and Japan in the 1850s and 70s determined the Far Eastern borders of the state, giving it territorial increments. Joining in the 1850s Amur and Primorye, and in the 1860s to 80s. Central Asia completed the formation of the Russian Empire. At the end of the 19th century, of particular relevance to Russian diplomacy is the issue of European security. The growth of rivalry for the colonies and the desire of Germany to maintain a dominant position in Europe made Russia move away from the existing system of alliances and move towards rapprochement with France. The signing of the Russian-French Treaty in 1893 was the first step towards the formation of a system of those mutual obligations of St. Petersburg and Paris, which served as the basis for the creation of the Entente, an alliance of Russia, France and England, designed to oppose the expansionist plans of the Union of the Central Powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary and Italy. In the Far East, the situation of Russia, to no avail trying to prevent a clash with Japan, also became more and more difficult. The defeat of the country in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904–1905 set a new task for the Russian Foreign Ministry, the restoration of undermined influence in the Far East. In the 19th and early XX centuries, the structure and organizational foundations of the Russian Foreign Ministry were further developed. In 1846, the establishment of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs Regulation on the Ministry of Foreign Affairs was adopted, which determined the new structure and functions of the ministry. In 1859, A.M. Gorchakov approved the rules for determining the service and position in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. In 1868, the establishment of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs was put into effect. In 1906, Minister of Foreign Affairs A.P. Izvolsky modernized the Foreign Affairs Agency. In particular, the press department was created, the responsibility of which was to monitor the publications of the Russian and foreign press on international issues and give public opinion explanations regarding the activities of the ministry. By 1913, Russia significantly expanded the range of diplomatic and consular overseas missions. If in 1758 there were 11 Russian agencies abroad, then in 1868 to 102, in 1897 to 147, and in 1903 to 173. By the beginning of World War I, Russia maintained diplomatic relations with 47 countries and had more than 200 representations for abroad. During the First World War, Russian diplomacy faced new problems. It was necessary to complete the transformation of the Entente into a full-fledged military-political alliance, to establish effective interaction between the Allies. The reality of wartime required the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Russia to carry out outreach and counter-propaganda functions, use external levers to supply the army, take care of prisoners of war, etc. More and more public and economic diplomacy made themselves known. The structure of the Foreign Ministry was optimized, within the framework of which the Prisoners of War Division, the Special Political Division, the Legal and Economic Departments were created. After 1917, a new stage began in the history of Russian diplomacy. In accordance with the decree of the All-Russian Congress of Soviets of October 26, November 8, the People's Commissariat for Foreign Affairs was formed, headed by L.D. Trotsky. The Brest Peace Treaty with Germany and its allies gave Russia the opportunity to exit the First World War. During the 1920s, the efforts of Soviet diplomacy were aimed at removing the country from political isolation, restoring it as a recognized, equal and inalienable subject of international relations. Russia participated in the Genoese and Lausanne conferences, concluded the Rapallo Treaty with Germany. In 1924, the USSR recognition strip began, diplomatic relations with many countries of the world were restored. In the 1930s, Soviet diplomacy advocated the creation of a collective security system, sought to prevent the formation of an anti-Soviet coalition and avoid the threat of a major military conflict involving the USSR, and worked hard to strengthen the state's foreign policy positions. Important steps were the establishment of diplomatic relations with the United States 1933, the entry of the USSR into the League of Nations 1934. The futility of efforts to create an alliance with Western countries against fascist aggression, the failure of negotiations with England and France on this issue and the desire to avoid a military clash with Hitler led to the signing of treaties with Germany in August-September 1939. During the war years, the main tasks of Soviet diplomacy were related to the creation and strengthening of the anti-Hitler coalition, the opening of a second front in Europe, the development of fundamental inter-alliance documents, and post-war settlement. The Soviet Union became one of the founding states of the United Nations. In the interwar period and during the war years, the structure and organizational foundations of the NKID were debugged. In 1923, the regulation on the NKID of the USSR was approved. For the training of professional personnel, the Higher Diplomatic School, now the Diplomatic Academy of the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, was established in 1939, and MGIMO in 1944. In 1941 and 1943, diplomatic ranks were introduced for the NKID employees and the diplomatic uniform was approved. Since 1954, the everyday uniform was cancelled, only the formal uniform for extraordinary and plenipotentiary ambassadors and envoys was preserved. In March 1946, the NKID was renamed the USSR Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The priority direction of the foreign policy of Soviet diplomacy in the post-war period was the struggle for peace, international détente and disarmament. Much has been done to strengthen the credibility of the UN as a universal tool designed to regulate international relations. The main steps were taken to establish relations with the liberated states of Europe, to restore peace in the Asia-Pacific region. The Soviet Union and its diplomatic service played a leading role in the political and legal support for the decolonization of Afro-Asian peoples. The bipolar nature of the established world system, leading to crisis situations, the Korean War, the Hungarian and Czechoslovak events of 1956 and 1968, respectively, the Caribbean crisis of 1962, the war in Vietnam, the entry of Soviet troops into Afghanistan, etc., made Russian diplomacy a necessity political resolution of these conflicts. The vigorous activity of Soviet diplomacy made it possible to reach practical agreements in bilateral relations with Western countries. Treaty with the FRG of 1970, the document Fundamentals of Relations between the USSR and the USA in 1972. Domestic diplomacy made a major contribution to the pan-European process, an important milestone of which was the signing in 1975 of the final act of the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe in Helsinki. The USSR Ministry of Foreign Affairs contributed to reaching agreements with leading Western countries, primarily with the United States, in the field of limiting the arms race and disarmament, Treaty on the Limitation of Anti-Ballistic Missile Defense (ABM), and the Interim Agreement on Certain Measures in the Field of the Limitation of Strategic Offensive Arms (START-I, 1972). The employees of the diplomatic service and veterans are awarded with awards. Flowers are laid on a memorial plaque in the building of the ministry with the names of our colleagues who fell on the fronts of the Great Patriotic War, as well as on the memorial plaques of diplomats who died in the line of duty and during the years of Stalin's repressions. Flowers are laid at the burial sites of prominent Russian diplomats in Russia and abroad.